Arizona Territory, 1881. The dust had not settled behind her horse before Della Calder saw him, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe that first moment without making it sound like something out of a dime novel. There was smoke, thin and pale, rising from a brush shelter near the edge of the agency boundary. There was the smell of juniper and something bitter underneath it, like crushed roots, and there was a man kneeling over a small fire, grinding bark between two flat stones, who looked up at her before she had even reined in her horse, as though he had heard her coming long before she arrived. "You are the Calder girl," he said. It was not a question. "I need a healer," Della said, and her voice cracked on the word the way it had not cracked in 3 days of trying to keep it steady for her father's sake. "My father is dying, and the doctor in Cedar Creek is 2 days out on a case in Prescott. And I have tried everything I know, and I am asking you because I do not know what else to do." The man studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that took in more than her face, that seemed to weigh the dust on her skirt and the shake in her hands, and the fact that she had ridden alone to the edge of a reservation most white women in the territory would not have approached without an armed escort. "My name is Kaywin," he said finally, standing and wiping the bark dust from his palms. "Tell me his symptoms while I gather what I need." She had spent 26 years learning how to be useful, and almost none of it learning how to ask for help. That was the quiet wound underneath everything else in Della's life, the one she never said aloud even to herself. Her mother had died when Della was 14. And from that day on, she had been the one who held the Calder ranch together in every way that did not show up on a deed. She cooked, she nursed, she kept the books, she turned away 2 men who might have married her because her father needed her more than either of them did, and somewhere in the middle of all that necessary work, she had stopped being a woman anyone thought to ask what she wanted. She had simply become the person who showed up, reliable, useful, invisible in the particular way that useful people become invisible, because no one thinks to wonder what it costs the person who never says no. She wanted to stop here for just a moment, because this is the part of the story I think about the most. This channel has found its way to people watching from Brazil, from Nigeria, from India, from the Philippines, from Mexico, from South Africa, from places I never could have imagined a story like this one would travel. And if tonight is the first night you are hearing one of these stories, I am glad you are here. This channel is still young. We are just getting started. And if a story like Della's finds a place in you, hitting subscribe helps more than you would guess. And it means we get to keep telling stories like hers. Now let's get back. Because Kaywin had already swung a bundle of dried bark and roots over his shoulder and was asking her which horse was fastest. They rode for the Calder ranch without another word between them. And it was not until they reached the porch that Della understood how much she had risked simply by asking. A white mountain Apache man riding openly onto a settler's land with no agent's pass in his pocket and no escort of any kind was breaking a rule that could cost him his freedom of movement for months, maybe longer. She did not know that yet. She only knew that her father was burning with a fever that had not broken in 4 days, that his lips had gone the color of ash, and that the man beside her moved like someone who had seen this fever before and beaten it. Thomas Calder was 58 years old and had never in his life allowed a stranger to touch him without protest. But by the time Kaywin knelt beside his bed, he was too far gone in the fever to do anything but mutter and shiver. Kaywin pressed 2 fingers to the old man's wrist, held them there a long moment, and then began unpacking the bundle without hurry. the way a man unpacks tools he trusts completely. "Willow bark for the fever," he said, mostly to himself, dropping a handful into the pot of water Della had set to boil. "Osha root for what is happening in his chest. You hear that sound when he breathes." "I hear it," Della said. "I have heard it for 2 days, and it frightens me more than the fever does." "It should," Kaywin said, not unkindly. "It means we work through the night." They did work through the night, the two of them trading places at Thomas Calder's bedside as the hours wore down, Kaywin steeping bark and root into a bitter tea he coaxed past the old man's cracked lips a spoonful at a time. Della wringing cool cloths and pressing them to her father's neck and wrists exactly as she was told. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, with the fire burned low and the whole house gone quiet except for her father's ragged breathing, Della finally asked the question she had been holding back out of manners. "Why did you come? You do not know us. You do not owe us anything, and you have put yourself at risk to be here. I understand enough about the past system to know that." Kaywin was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "3 winters ago," he said finally, "I could not save my wife from a fever very much like this one. There was no one who knew what I know now. I was young, and what I knew was not enough, and I watched her go because of it." He looked at Thomas Calder's chest, rising and falling, still ragged but steadier than it had been an hour before. "I have spent every season since learning everything my grandmother could teach me about the plants that fight fevers like this. I did not learn it so that I could watch it happen again and do nothing, whoever it was happening to." Della did not have words for what that answer did to her, so she said nothing and simply sat with him through what remained of the night. By sunrise, Thomas Calder's fever had broken. His breathing had eased. He was still weak, still pale, but his eyes opened and found his daughter's face. And he managed a whisper that sounded almost like himself again. And Della put her face in her hands and wept in a way she had not allowed herself to do in 3 days of forcing herself to stay calm for his sake. Kaywin left before the sun was fully up, saying he needed to be back inside the agency boundary before the morning count, and Della walked him as far as the fence line, not knowing what to say to a man who had just handed her father back to her. "I don't know how to repay this," she said. "You don't," he said, and there was the faintest trace of a smile in it. That was never the arrangement. He paused at the fence, one hand on the worn top rail. "But if his fever returns or the cough settles deeper, send word. I will come." This is only the second story I have brought to this channel, and already I find myself wondering how many of you have sat up through a night like that one, keeping watch over someone you were terrified of losing. If you have, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and what you are doing while you listen to this. I like knowing how far these stories travel, and I like knowing I am not the only one who has sat awake counting someone else's breaths until morning. Now, let's get back, because word travels fast in a town the size of Cedar Creek, and not all of it kindly. It took less than a week for the whole of Cedar Creek to know that an Apache healer had ridden onto the Calder ranch in the middle of the night, and that Thomas Calder was alive because of it. Most of the town took it as it was, a desperate act by a desperate daughter that had, against the odds, worked. But Warren Colton took it differently. Colton owned the largest spread bordering the Calder ranch, and for 2 years he had made it known around town that he intended to marry Della Calder, more for the convenience of joining their 2 properties into one than for any particular tenderness he held for her. Della had never given him reason to believe she would accept. But Colton was a man who mistook the absence of a firm no for the presence of a yes he simply had not collected yet. He rode out to the Calder ranch on a Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, wearing the expression of a man who believed he was about to do someone a great favor by warning them. "Folks are talking, Della," he said, standing on her porch like he had some right to it. "An Indian from the agency riding out here at night, no pass, no escort. It doesn't look right. It isn't right, regardless of how it looks. He saved my father's life, Warren. I don't much care how it looks.
You are not welcome.
It isn't
here.
only about how it looks. It's against the law for him to be off that reservation without a signed pass from the agent. I'd hate for something to happen to him on account of a kindness nobody asked him to risk his neck for." The threat inside the concern was not subtle, and Della heard it clearly enough. "I could speak to Agent Ashford about it, or I could not. Depends on whether I have reason to." Della understood exactly what he was offering and exactly what he expected in return for his silence. And something in her that had spent 12 years being careful and accommodating and endlessly patient simply refused to bend for him one more time. "Say whatever you feel you have to say to Agent Ashford, Warren. I won't be trading my father's life or Kaywin's freedom for your good opinion of me." Colton's jaw tightened, and he left without another word, and Della stood on the porch a long while after his horse had disappeared down the road, her hands shaking, not entirely sure whether she had just done something brave or something reckless. Not everyone in Cedar Creek took Colton's view of things. Mrs. Pruitt from the Mercantile, who had lost her own husband to a fever 2 winters back with no healer of any kind able to reach them in time, told Della plainly the next time she came in for supplies that she did not care what color the hands were that had saved Thomas Calder, only that they had done it. The blacksmith's wife said much the same, more quietly, over a length of yard goods. It was not the whole town standing with her, not by a long measure, but it was enough to remind Della that Colton's version of Cedar Creek's opinion was smaller than he liked to pretend it was. In the weeks that followed, the historical reality of the pass system sat over every visit like a held breath. Apache people confined to the San Carlos and Fort Apache reservations in that period could not legally leave the boundary without a paper pass signed by the Indian agent, and violation of that rule could mean confinement, withheld rations, or worse, entirely at the discretion of whichever agent happened to be enforcing it that season. Every time Kaywin rode out to check on Thomas Calder's recovering lungs, he was risking exactly the kind of punishment Colton had threatened to invite down on him. And both of them knew it, and neither of them stopped. He came back 3 more times that month. First, to check that the cough in Thomas Calder's chest had fully cleared, and then, when there was no longer any medical reason to, simply because Della had started leaving a lantern lit on the porch on the evenings she hoped he might come, and he had started noticing which evenings those were. They talked on that porch more than they ever had over her father's sickbed. She learned that his grandmother had raised him after his own parents died in an outbreak the Army's arrival had brought through their band's territory years before he was born. And that healing had become, for him, less a duty and more the only language he had left for loving people without losing them. He learned that Della had turned away a young man from Prescott 2 years earlier, a man who had courted her seriously until her father's health worsened, and he realized what a life with her would actually require of him, and that he had left rather than share the weight of it. He decided I wasn't worth what it would cost him, Della said one evening, watching the last light go copper over the ridge. I have spent 2 years telling myself I didn't want to be chosen that badly anyway. I'm not certain I believed it. I think Kaywin said carefully. That a person who leaves because staying is difficult was never choosing you in the first place. He was choosing the version of you that didn't ask anything of him. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before, and she found she had no ready answer for it. Only the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being seen exactly as she was and not found wanting for it. His own people were not uniformly glad of where his evenings had started going either. His cousin Deshki, who scouted for the army out of Fort Apache and had little patience left for settlers after years of grazing rights promised and never honored, rode out one afternoon to find him grinding bark in the shade and asked him plainly what he thought he was doing. 3 times in a month for a cough that cleared weeks ago, Deshki said. You know what this territory has cost our grandmother's whole generation, and you ride out there for a settler girl's porch light like it means nothing. It is not nothing, Kaywin said. She has never once treated what I know as a curiosity, or my being there as a favor she was owed. Most of them do. She does not. That is one woman, Deshke said. It is not the territory. No, Kaywin agreed. It is one woman. I did not ask you to trust the territory. I only ask you not to report where I have been. Deshke did not answer that directly, and he did not report it either. But he did not come around again for a long while, and Kaywin understood the silence for exactly what it was, a trust extended reluctantly, and only halfway. There was, too, a night in late June when the fever Kaywin thought he had beaten came back for a second try. Thomas Calder woke coughing so hard he could not catch his breath between fits. And Della, half asleep and terrified, sent the ranch hand riding for the agency boundary before she had even finished pulling on her boots. Kaywin arrived past midnight to find the cough had settled deep in the old man's chest, a sound like a door dragging over gravel with every breath. And for the first time since that first fevered night, Della watched real uncertainty cross his face. "Talk to me," she said. "Whatever it is, I would rather know. It may only be the same fever finishing what it started," Kaywin said, already working. "Or it may be settling into his lungs the way it does sometimes in men his age. I will not know which until morning." He looked at her, steady despite the hour. "I need you to trust me through the night the same as you did the first time." She did, spooning broth and bitter tea past her father's lips exactly as instructed, packing his chest with warm cloths soaked in a tallow and juniper mixture Kaywin swore by. And somewhere near dawn, the ragged dragging sound in her father's breathing eased into something like ordinary sleep. Kaywin sat back on his heels, worn through in a way Della had not seen in him before, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You were afraid?" Della said quietly. It was not an accusation. "I have already lost someone to a night like this one," Kaywin said. "I am always afraid, every time. I have simply learned not to let the fear decide what my hands do." In the weeks that followed, Della began riding out to the edge of the reservation boundary herself, not only to see Kaywin, but to learn what he knew. Kneeling beside him in the scrub while he taught her to tell willow from cottonwood by the bark alone, to recognize osha root by its bitter, celery-like smell, to know which plants eased a fever and which merely masked one. She had spent her whole life being useful in ways that asked nothing of her mind, only her hands. And she found something changing in her as she filled a notebook with his knowledge, translating where she could into the terms her father's old medical almanac used, marking carefully what matched and what did not. Kaywin watched her fill page after page with a kind of wonder of his own. "You do not have to write it all down," he told her once. "I am not going anywhere." "I know," Della said. "I am writing it down because it matters, and because I have spent my whole life keeping everyone else's records and never once writing down anything that was mine to keep." It could not last as quietly as it had begun, and it did not. Late in the summer, Colton made good on the threat he had dressed up as concern. He rode to the sub-agency himself and reported to Agent Ashford that an Apache man from the reservation had been observed repeatedly off the reservation boundary without a pass, visiting a white settler's home under circumstances Colton described with careful emphasis as improper. That particular summer made caution easy to justify. Trouble had been building across the territory for months. Unrest among several Apache bands that would, before autumn was out, boil over into open conflict near Sibique Creek to the north, and every Indian agent in Arizona territory was under pressure from Washington to enforce the pass system without exception, whatever the reason behind any single violation. Kaywin's timing could not have been worse, and both Della and Thomas understood, riding to the agency that morning, that they were asking Ashford to make an exception in the one season he had the least room to make one. Agent Ashford was not a cruel man, but he was a rule-bound one, responsible for enforcing a system he had not designed and did not always agree with, in a territory where any perceived leniency toward the reservation population could bring trouble down on him from Washington. He sent for Kaywin and confined him to the agency grounds pending review, which in practice meant Kaywin could not leave to check on anyone, could not explain himself to Della, could not do anything but wait while rumor did the explaining for him in whatever shape suited the people spreading it. Della heard about the confinement from a rancher's wife in town, delivered with the particular relish some people reserve for other people's misfortune, and she felt something in her chest go cold and then hot in quick succession. She thought of the porch light she had left burning for 3 nights running with no rider coming down the road to meet it, and she understood, finally and completely, that she was not going to sit quietly on this one the way she had sat quietly on so many things in her life. She went to her father first, who was strong enough by then to sit up in his own chair and drink his coffee without help, and told him everything, the whole of it, from the fever to the porch to Colton's visit to what she now intended to do. "You want to go before Ashford yourself," Thomas said. It was not a question either, and Della was beginning to notice how much that particular way of speaking reminded her of someone else. "I want you to come with me," she said. "You're the one whose life he saved. Nobody can argue with that the way they can argue with me." Thomas Calder set down his coffee cup, and for the first time in longer than Della could remember, he looked at his daughter the way a father looks at someone he is proud of rather than someone he depends on. "Then we'll go together," he said. "It's the least I owe the man, and it is well past time I stopped letting you carry everything in this family alone." They rode to the sub-agency the next morning, and Agent Ashford, to his credit, agreed to hear them. Thomas Calder told the story plainly without embellishment, because the truth needed none. He described the fever, the 2 days with no doctor within reach, his daughter's desperate ride to the agency boundary, and the man who had come back with her and sat up through the night with a stranger's suffering, because he could not bear to watch another fever take a life he had the knowledge to save. "I am alive because of Kaywin," Thomas said. "Not because of anyone's permission, and not because the rules made room for it. He broke your rule to save a settler's life, Agent Ashford, and I would consider it a poor kind of justice if the reward for that was punishment." Ashford listened, turning his pen over in his hands. And when Della spoke, she did not plead. She simply told him what she had told Colton on her own porch weeks before, that she would not trade anyone's freedom for her own convenience, and that if the territory's rules had no room for a man saving a life, then the rules were the thing that needed examining, not the man. Ashford rubbed a hand over his face, clearly turning the matter over. "You understand my position," he said. "If I let this pass unanswered because the outcome happened to be good, I open the door to every man on that reservation deciding for himself which rules are worth keeping and which are not. In the one season, I can least afford that. Washington is already asking me why I cannot keep order out here.
We cannot afford to make another
And if you
mistake.
punish a man for saving a
Lives are depending
life,"
on us doing this.
Della said, "you will have taught every person on both sides of that boundary line exactly what this territory thinks a life is worth. I do not believe that is the order you are trying to keep, Agent Ashford. I believe it is the opposite of it." Ashford said nothing to that for a long moment, only turned his pen over and over between his fingers, and Thomas Calder, sensing the argument had landed where it needed to, said nothing further either, letting the silence do what more words could not. It was not defiance that moved Ashford in the end, and it was not romance, though he must have suspected there was more to the story than a grateful patient's testimony. It was the plain, uncomfortable fact that a genuine service had been done at real personal risk, with no request for anything in return, and that punishing it on the word of a jealous neighbor would have been its own kind of injustice dressed up as order. Ashford released Kaywin from confinement that same week, and after a longer conversation than either Della or Thomas were made party to, issued him a standing pass, a document rare enough in that period to draw attention on its own, permitting him to travel between the agency and Cedar Creek for the specific purpose of providing medical treatment to settlers who requested it. It was not everything. It did not undo the system that had made his kindness a crime in the first place, and neither Della nor Kaywin ever pretended otherwise in the years that followed. But it was enough of an opening for a life to grow through, the way grass finds its way up through a cracked stretch of hardpan given half a season of rain. Warren Colton, for his part, found that a town which had briefly entertained his version of events lost its taste for him once Thomas Calder's testimony made the rounds. He sold his spread 2 years later and moved north, and nobody in Cedar Creek much mourned the absence. 5 years passed, and Arizona Territory in 1886 was not an easy place for a white mountain Apache man and a settler's daughter to build an ordinary life together, and I will not pretend to you that it was simple, or that every door in Cedar Creek opened for them the way the agents had. There was gossip that never fully quieted, and there were families in town who never did warm to the sight of them together at the general store. But there was also the small healing house they built together at the edge of the Calder land, close enough to the agency boundary that Kaywin's standing pass let him move between both worlds without breaking a single rule, and close enough to town that settlers who would once have crossed the street to avoid an Apache healer now rode out for willow bark tea and osha root salve without a second thought, because word travels just as fast when the story is a good one. Thomas Calder lived another 11 years, long enough to hold his granddaughter, a girl they named Sarah, on the same porch where Della had once left a lantern burning for a man she was not yet sure would come back. Deshki came around eventually too, in his own time and his own way. He arrived unannounced the week Sarah was born, said almost nothing, examined the baby with the same careful scrutiny he had once turned on Kaywin's choices, and left a small carved horse on the porch rail without comment. Della found it the next morning and understood it for what it was, an apology that would never be spoken aloud, offered in the only language some kinds of stubborn pride allow. He visited twice a year after that, always unannounced, always leaving before he could be properly thanked. And Sarah grew up thinking of him as a kind of weather that came and went rather than a person who had once tried to talk her father out of loving her mother. The lantern still hung there, though it had long since stopped being a signal and had simply become part of the house. The way certain habits outlive the need that first created them. Sarah asked about it once, small hand wrapped around the porch rail, wanting to know why a lantern nobody lit anymore still hung there collecting dust. Della knelt down to her level and told her the truth, that once there had been a night when she did not know if the person she was waiting for would come back at all, and that she had decided to leave a light burning anyway because hoping out loud, even to no one, had felt better than not hoping at all. Sarah considered this with the total seriousness only small children can manage, and then asked if she could light it herself sometime, just to see. Della told her she could light it any night she wanted, and meant it as more than permission. On quiet evenings, Della would sometimes catch the smell of juniper smoke drifting from the healing house behind theirs, mixed with something bitter underneath it, and it would carry her straight back to that first ride to the edge of the reservation, dust rising behind her horse, terrified and certain all at once that she was about to ask a stranger for the one thing she had never learned how to ask anyone for: help. I think about Della's story sometimes as a story about medicine, because in a way it is one. But mostly I think of it as a story about what happens when someone finally stops being useful long enough to be honest about what they need, and about the particular kind of courage it takes to keep showing up for a person even when the law itself has not yet decided you are allowed to. Some kinds of healing happen in a single night beside a fevered bed. Others take 5 years, a standing pass, and the stubborn refusal of two people to let a system that was never built with them in mind decide who they were allowed to love. I hope, wherever you are watching this from tonight, that you have someone willing to break the rules to sit up with you until morning. And if you don't, yet, I hope this story is a reminder that it is never foolish to ask.